My name is John McKenna. Nearly 23 years ago now, my wife and I wrote the first edition of a book called The Irish Food Guide. This is it here, illustrated by Alwyn Gillespie and published by a little company called Anna Livia Press in Dublin. We had bought a car for 100 quid, toured around Ireland for 6 months, spent another 3 months writing the book, and funny enough, what we found then has been the very people and places that we've written about ever since for almost a quarter of a century. So, 2 years later, we produced this. This was the first Bridgestone Irish Food Guide with a bunch of people from Bridgestone Tyres who we worked with for 21 years. This is the first book that we also published ourselves. We set up a little company called Estragon Press, named in honour of Samuel Beckett's character, of course, from Waiting for Godot. And we got lucky with this one because we managed to win an André Simon Special Prize in the UK. So it was a very good luck book for us, even though the illustration by Ken Buggy on the cover shows a key on a table, which some people say is actually really bad luck. Now, 2 years later, and here is Hazel Burke from a Sullis house in North Cork, photographed on the cover of the second edition of the Bridgestone Irish Food Guide. You can see already it's getting much bigger. Things were beginning to happen in Irish food at quite a pace. Again, we got lucky with this one. We were shortlisted for a Glenfiddich Award. We didn't win, however, but that was still a nice thing to happen. With wonderful illustrations again by Ken Buggy, and the book was really the beginning in the early 90s now of Irish food culture starting to really speed up. Now, what we did then was we took a little detour and we had an edition published in France, Irlande Gourmande. Didn't do very well, but it was notable for the fact that we had a launch in Paris which was attended by the rudest Parisian food journalists we had ever met in our entire lives. We had 3 wonderful chefs over with us to cook dinner for them. Jerry Galvin of Drumcong House, the late Robbie Miller of Shanks in Northern Ireland, and the late Michael Clifford of Clifford's in Cork, and they knocked the Parisians out, though the Parisians weren't going to admit that. It was 3 years from the second food guide before this came along in 1996, the Bridgestone Irish Food Guide, and that's us on the cover. You can see that I still couldn't afford to buy a tie back in those days. Designed by Nick Kahn. The reason why we're on the cover, of course critics should really be anonymous, but we had a television series, McKenna's Ireland, which we'd filmed for RTE, produced by Louis Lenton, directed by Mickey O'Neill. We were also making babies at this time, so this was a pretty busy period of time for us. And again, the book is getting bigger. The Irish economy is starting to really rev up, and there's a great sense of community by this stage amongst the producers and the restaurateurs and the farmers in the book. So another 3 years passed, and another Irish food guide, this time featuring the photography on the cover of Mike O'Toole, who we were to work with on a number of subsequent books. Again, the book is heavier, a lot is happening in Irish food. So much was happening, in fact, that 3 years later, we split the book in 2. We had the Traveller's Guide and we had the Shopper's Guide. We thought these were rather nice, and they featured really funky illustrations by Aoife Wasser, but everybody suddenly said, do you know what? The Irish Food Guide should be one book. So we listened. 2004, we were back. Now this is the beginning, of course, of a 6-photograph grid, which really characterises our books to this very day. Again, wonderful photography by Mike O'Toole, and the book just keeps on getting bigger. It's now 2007, and we suddenly have a doorstop. This is the period in time when the Irish think they are the richest nation in the world, and certainly if spending on food and wine and in farmers' markets is anything to go by, that's the way they're certainly behaving. This is now a book up to 500 pages long. But then something interesting happens, because between this book, the 8th edition, and this, the 9th, the country falls off a cliff. September 2008 wipes out the Irish economy, and yet the 9th edition of the Bridgestone Irish Food Guide is again 100 pages longer than the previous edition. So we're in the worst recession in 30 years, but there's no recession in Irish speciality food. And that brings us to here. The 10th edition of the book, 700 pages long, back to its original title, The Irish Food Guide. And quite extraordinarily, it's never been bigger, and the people in it have never been better. More committed, more successful, more dynamic, more creative. So over 23 years and 10 editions of the Irish Food Guide, it's been a privilege to write about people who have rewritten the very concept of what we understand as Irish food, and have, we think, created some of the best food in the world.